Welcome, everybody. Delighted to have you here for this event. My name is Al-Noor Ibrahim. I'm on the faculty here at the Fletcher School, as well as at the Tisch College of Civic Life. So I'm grateful to both institutions for sponsoring this event. We're going to have a conversation with President Carlos Alvarado, 48th president of Costa Rica, from 2018 to 2022. So he just stepped down late last spring and joined the faculty here in the summer. Prior to that, he was Minister of Human Development and Social Inclusion. Before that, Minister of Labor and Social Security, or actually simultaneously for part of that. And before political office, got his start in managerial leadership with the private sector with Procter & Gamble in Latin America. So all of that was the warm-up act for coming to join us here at Tufts University. So I'm really delighted to have you here. I'm also really delighted that he's joined by First Lady Claudia Dobles Camargo, who's an architect and urban planner, as well as their young son, who we look forward to meeting. So when Dean Rachel Kite introduced President Alvarado to the community, she wrote, and I quote, "He has been an inspiring example of how political leaders can pursue effective governance while championing nature." We often don't talk about political, global governance and nature together, but the former president brings them together. Dean Kite also said, as president, he demonstrated how a small state like Costa Rica can work to find solutions for global crises when large countries will not or cannot. He's widely praised for his ambitious climate policies, but also a really successful response to the COVID pandemic in Costa Rica. And part of the question we're going to try to unpack in the next hour is how? Right? How does a small state do this sort of thing? And I'll give you sort of one indication. In 2019, so we're looking at 4 years ago, Costa Rica launched its national decarbonization plan, which was really the first of its kind under the Paris Agreement. Many countries still not have launched theirs. And so here's a small state taking action on the global stage. And there's many others that we will highlight today. He's been recognized in many contexts. The National Geographic Society gave him the Planetary Leadership Award in 2022 for outstanding commitment and action towards protecting the oceans. The United Nations Environment Program gave him a Champion of the Earth Award for policy leadership, and the list goes on. So really delighted to have you here with us. I'm going to begin with a few questions. We'll have a bit of a back and forth, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions. So there'll be a good amount of time for you to pose your questions, so please have those in mind. So the first question that I'd like to ask you is, Costa Rica is a small state, and we've talked about small states. But to put this in context for the rest of you here, if we think of Massachusetts, if it were to be a nation state, Massachusetts has a population of about 7 million. Costa Rica's is just over 5 million. Costa Rica's annual GDP is only about 10% of that of the state of Massachusetts. In terms of land area, it's a little bit bigger than Massachusetts. But on all of these measures, it's a small state. And yet it punches above its weight on a number of issues, including climate leadership. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit about, why do small states matter? And how is it that Costa Rica is able to punch above its weight?
Well, first of all, thank you, Alnora. You know that I really enjoy our talks in the past months, and I know this one I'll enjoy as well. And thank you to you all for being here, and thanks for also to the Tisch College for the invitation. I really enjoy my time here at Tufts and at Fletcher. it's a wonderful institution, and I hope you all enjoyed that time as well. When I went to pursue my master's, I found a beautiful book called "Small is Beautiful," and actually I bought it, a used copy of it, and it does ring a bell back then, both because it approached on several things of the economy of how perhaps not the traditional approach of making things big and scale, but it finded that in small approach to things there was some beauty, and being from Costa Rica, obviously that related to me. But then I realized that there's a power that goes beyond scale, that actually from small can impact scale. And I believe it has a lot to do with the power of example, the power of narrative, and that being a driver for good change to happen. And that has been consistent not only with the legacy of one administration like ours. Actually, we try to build on the legacy before us to keep pursuing that policy of leading by example. And that has been consistent in the case of the story of Costa Rica, at least I'll mention 3 cases. One has to do with the abolishment of the army. In 1949, Costa Rica decided to abolish the armed forces. And back then people said, that's impossible, that's suicide, you're not going to prosper as a nation without an army. But actually it was one of the key drivers of development, because instead of investing in military, that was devoted into healthcare, education, conservation. And also, we did not have that element that trigger in many Latin American countries dictatorships or coup d'etat. So that's also a power of example. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody should do that, but it demonstrates that that was possible. Because when I was in office, I celebrated the 70th anniversary of a country without an army, a whole generation of people that had been born. It's actually, yeah, more, it's like 3 generations now that don't know what it is to live with an army. Second has to do with healthcare. In 1941, universal healthcare was established in Costa Rica. And actually, that was even before that the UK created the national health system. And that was triggered, very influenced by the visions of the thinkers in Belgium. There was a Cardinal Mercier, and our president went there to study, so he brought those ideas. And he made the most uncommon alliance, which also talks about empathy, and the other, which I'd love to talk about. Back then in the 40s, he made an alliance between the Communist Party, the Catholic Church, and the Republican government to create the national health system, which is currently, when I was president, I celebrated the 80th anniversary of the healthcare system. So we are a nation without, as you mentioned, without that huge GDP, but our standards of health are of a developed country. We have the highest ratio of investment in health and the results. We have the best relation in terms of investments and results. And so that shows the power of example somehow. And the other one has to do with conservation. At the beginning of last century, in the 1920s, Costa Rica had 80% of forest coverage. Being a tropical country, it was just forest basically. But then, because of the economy moving and livestock and all agriculture, on the 1980, when I was born, forest coverage reduced to 20%. So that means it was dramatic what happened in terms of the environment in that time. And back then there there was no discussion of biodiversity, of climate change, but leadership back then realized that this was something negative. And they started creating first the national park systems, preserve different ecosystems. Costa Rica has 6% of the world's biodiversity. And this is because we are in a small strip, but it has the two oceans colliding, the winds, it has very different altitudes. So there's lots going on. There's the landscape is not monotone. So you can have changes in species by the meter in any direction. So first the national parks, and then programs like the payment for environmental services. Back then, they were saying that we should pay forest owners for having forests because of the services the forests provide to humanity. That is biodiversity, water conservation, carbon fixation, ecotourism. And back then, where I worked when I was in my 20s in that office on the environmental services, and back then that was kind of hippie. Everybody was saying, "Oh, that's so it's nonsense. I mean, who's paying the forest for services?" Now it's kind of a compelling argument, isn't it? But that was in the 80s and the 90s. Nowadays, Costa Rica has 55% of forest coverage. So it has demonstrated that reversing deforestation, it's not only possible, but profitable, because our economy, one of the huge drivers of our economy is tourism. So I put those three examples to say that it has been demonstrated that sometimes what it's considered as impossible, it's possible. And people might say, well, but that's Costa Rica. That's the exception that confirms the rule. It's too small. You cannot scale that up. But I don't think that's the case. Just to mention one short example briefly, that one of my two Christmas presents last year, on December last year, there was a discussion on the Los Angeles Times on the decarbonization plan of California.
Mm-hmm.
California is going in a process of decarbonization. And the discussion was that California should use not only the approach, but the parameters of proven plans. And the plan that they mentioned is Costa Rica. California is the fourth largest economy in the world. And even in the debate, we managed to put the example of decarbonization from such a small scale to a larger scale. Something has been accomplished in terms of leadership and an example. So I don't know if I'm addressing that directly, what the conclusion to your question is, but the thing is, small can actually influence large scale and can influence the debate and can drive positive change.
So I see how small can have a demonstration effect, right? With the decarbonization plan, now California picking it up. With the National Health Service, right? Prior to the UK's, we still don't have universal health coverage in the United States. So I see the demonstration effect that it can be done. It can show the context. It can show the legislation that's required. But take us to the next level in terms of scaling this. How do you take that then and say, build some sort of a movement among other political actors globally? You've been very effective at this. So if you might give us a couple of examples here, the 30 by 30 or others, where the leadership task has been coalition building. How have you accomplished that? And why would large states still take small states seriously, even in that context?
Well, I think that there's also a history of making that possible, but let me first go to the example I really was part of. There was when we got into the office on 2018, the scenario was complicated because most of the large actors were not committed with the climate catastrophe and environmental catastrophe agenda. So when we got there, the moment was very It was bleak in a different way that it is bleak now. At least now people are doing stuff. At the moment there was, so I remember talking to a dear friend who's Cristiana Figueres, who she was the executive of the climate convention at the time of the Paris Agreement and one of the key contributors to make the Paris Agreement happen. She's Costa Rican. We were talking and I was saying to her, well, we have these ambitions and we're moving forward, but also said, Cristiana, but I feel very lonely doing this. I mean, I believe in this, but perhaps a little bit the Europeans, but we are basically out there on our own. And she gave me a beautiful analogy that she said, like, imagine a huge highway and imagine all the trucks just putting their lights on and parking and blocking the road. But if you have a bicycle, you will manage to go forward. And the good thing is not only you will be moving forward, but everybody's going to be watching you because you're the only one moving. And that managed to be true. We grab our bicycle, we very rapidly created our decarbonization plan. 10 pillars of a transformation, not in terms of environment, it's a transformation of the whole of society as a whole. I think if I look back, I think that calling it decarbonization plan, it's effective, but it's not comprehensive. It's also it's a sustainable transition transformational plan. It's more it's like an empathy plan. It's like it's not only about decarbonization, but well, back then we didn't have perhaps developed that kind of thinking, so we were into the decarbonization plan, and actually it had that impact. I was really impressed about it because we really worked hard, and it was not only the Ministry of Environment, it was across all the ministries, institutions, and also private sector and also NGOs. And when it came out, it had nationally, it was not so powerful because people will say, well, we're changing stuff that we somehow are been doing. But internationally, it had a huge impact because we were the bicycle. Yeah, we were the bicycle on the 5-lane highway. And so that started gaining some leverage. Actually, it gained some leverage that we had lots of funding to pursue many of the work that needed to be done. So also that proved to be a competitive advantage. And back then, again, many people said, and whenever you listen to somebody say it's impossible, you're on the right track. Keep going. Because people said it's impossible. I mean, you're not going to make this happen. And actually, you're going to destroy the economy. And people start saying that it's very nice, but you're going to destroy your economy. So we command a independent study from the Inter-American Development Bank, from the Rand Foundation and others. And they made an analysis on the decarbonization plan on the cost benefit. That was published on 2021, actually. And that demonstrated that it was not only good in terms of the sustainability, but it actually was profitable. The plan has a $40 billion net utility after they're secured by 2050. So if in 2019, we caught the attention of people because of the plan, in 2021, we caught the attention because many people said, okay, but this is profitable as well. It's a good business. And it's kind of intuitive. I think that we're missing that part in the debate. And I think that's, for example, the one insight behind the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US. If you need to do a whole transformation of how you produce, that means you're going to go through another huge revolution, industrial revolution, industrial green sustainable revolution. That means lots of investment, lots of innovation, lots of transformation, and that means huge opportunities as well. What I believe is we have a huge resistance to change, and we are somehow in denial. I recently gave an interview to a Canadian network, and I said that fighting today for oil and gas, it's like if you in the 90s were a stockholder of Kodak I don't know if people remember Kodak once, but fighting today for oil and gas is like in the 90s defending the future of Kodak and not transforming. If the executives at Kodak, well, now it's very easy to say it, but if they will have used all their dominance in the market to create their future and to innovate and to not resist change, Kodak will still be perhaps one of the big players in the digital world, whatever. That didn't happen. So countries, we need to start thinking not in the Kodak framework, but in the future framework. So to your question, sorry for the big detour. After that, we started pushing. We hosted the pre-COP, and when Brazil was not going to organize the COP, and there we created a group, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. It was just a few countries, and we said we're going to push for the 30 by 30 goal. That's 30% of the ocean, 30% of the land protected by 2030 in order to help reverse the impact of climate change, but also to preserve biodiversity loss, which is we're living actually through a extinction process rapidly. And back then, 2019, people said that's too ambitious, it's too complex, it's impossible. But then we started to move, and Costa Rica and France share that, and then the UK comment about. But actually, it was Costa Rica that somehow gave the credibility that we were going to do that, because there's obviously, if the UK or France are leading, there's obviously this sense of, well, it's kind of a colonial perspective and whatever. But that started to move, and we started to recruit lots of allies. In 2021, in the COP, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Costa Rica announced the expansions of their ocean protected areas. We protected 30% of our ocean. In Cocos Island, we went from 3% of ocean protection to 30% of ocean protection. By the way, Costa Rica is 92% ocean. It's only 8% land. So the portion of we covered a portion of our protected area. It's a little bit larger than our continental area. So it's a huge proportion of the ocean protected. With those 4 countries, there is a big corridor that goes from Galapagos to Cocos Island, because we started to recruit allies.
Can you say a bit about this allies recruitment? Because I can imagine that there may be a handful that were quite willing and interested in joining, that didn't need a lot of persuasion, but most are likely to be fence sitters, if not outright resistors.
Well, I think that the good part of it is somehow that leading that coalition was actually fostering, inviting, but not owning. I think that was the key of it. Not making like, this is my movement, and we own this. No, it was something very organic, very, very empathic. And the people, the leadership that was around that, from the private, from the nonprofits, and even the leaders, there was that feeling. It was very, very selfless in that sense. We were very towards the gold. As we say in Spanish, it was about the miracle, not about the saint. It was about getting it done. So that allowed to recruit lots of people, and then it became more like a movement and then when the coalition started to grow, we were like, okay, now we are 40 countries. And then by the next meeting, oh, now we are 80 countries. And by the next one, we were saying we're heading in Glasgow, we said we need to reach, and there we reached 100 countries in Glasgow. So that gained momentum. And by the other hand, we, with example there, demonstrated that it was possible to break. And then again, being the first movers also brought the attention of philanthropy, of donors, if we started to make it happen, enforcing it. So there was a first mover advantage. And the other gift in Christmas this year was that in Montreal, in the COP of the Biodiversity COP, 196 countries agree on the 30 by 30 goal. So in 2019, we were just like a handful and it was impossible. And in December 22, it's a global target for all governments in the world. So yeah, again, if whenever somebody says, and this applies not only to countries, I think it applies to people as well. Whenever somebody, or you feel too small, or you think that whatever you think is impossible or it's not worth doing, think twice. Having somebody tell you that cannot be done or that is impossible, it's a gift. Embrace it. Guard that, cherish that, because that's fuel, positive fuel for doing stuff, for getting stuff done.
I wonder if you might say a little bit about leadership as a style, something more personal. You've used the term empathy now, I think, at least 3 times in this conversation. And, you know, in the coalition building, you talked about it as fostering, inviting, but not owning. You know, it's not the portrayal of leader as hero. It's not the lionized leader. It's a different kind of a leader, which I would imagine requires a particular skill set, perhaps a particular mindset. Could you say a little bit more about this? And the related question is, can that type of leadership be taught? You know, you are teaching a course here called Leadership in the Public Sphere, so I'm assuming it can, but you know, if you'd say a little bit about that style of leadership and what are the challenges of teaching it?
Well, several things. One, that what you mentioned to me earlier when I was working with you to design the course, I think you mentioned that how we start learning from our students, that sometimes you get to wonder why is it me that's teaching and not them. But one of the key insight I've seen is that it's so powerful, this romanticized idealization we have of leadership. And there's like a narrative about, and we have the picture of it, right? Actually, it's the statue picture. It's the Napoleon picture. It's the white man on the horse picture, leadership. And that's the narrative that we carry as that's our nowadays programming, like the basic programming aims to that. But then when you start going deeper, you start to see the various dimensions that there are around leadership. Also, I've been thinking a lot about in today's world with social media and polarization and resentment, anger, hate. I think that there are the current approach to what's going on in many places is to get within one of the currents of that polarization in any position. And if you push hard enough, you're going to have another pole, but you may gain to win the power. It's a power game. So you don't benefit necessarily from building or from reaching out to the other, but you benefit in the power contest for making a larger gap or a larger difference. And that's happening in many places. But I do believe that there's a power in empathy, not to gain power itself, but for a larger end, which has to do with reaching out to the other and to the others. There's a lot of us and them going on right now. And I think that now courageous leadership has a lot to do somehow with renouncing to power, because that getting into an empathy position means renouncing to power, because you're not going to get the hit only, you're getting the hit from everywhere, because we're in a hate competition sometimes. But it's kind of renouncing to power, but on the other hand, to show the way, or to show that there's another possibility. There's another possibility of doing things. If that can be, I don't know if that can be taught. What I do tell what I'm talking a lot about to my students is that has a lot to do also with self-examination. We undermine the role that our personality and our feelings have at the moment of exercising politics. We don't really look into that. Sometimes we rationalize our emotions and then act in politics. But I think that we need to pursue that exercise to know ourselves well, to know our motivations, to know our values, to know our contributions, to know our aims. Me, perhaps because of personality, I'm never driven to polarization. Polarization, I think it's a very dangerous game. And perhaps one of my traits has to do a lot with resilience, with into exercising. But I think that's one of the huge challenges that we are facing today in any kind of leadership. Also because there's this big expectation in that conquest and contest of power that you need to be powerful at the same time. And empathy and feelings and being wrong and not knowing things, it's not, there's not an award in democracies for that, because then you're weak or not tough enough for the job or the task ahead. But that's why I think that now somehow leading, it's giving up power. Yeah, it's kind of it's not intuitive, but
can you make this concrete for us? Can you give us an example, either within your national leadership context within Costa Rica, an incident where you had a choice to sort of exercise the traditional formal authority and you chose the empathetic approach? And what was that like? Was it difficult? Can you give us an illustration?
yes, I think I faced that several times. One was with the actual formation of government, because when we won the election, we won the executive, but in Congress in Costa Rica is one chamber and only 57 representatives. It's a small chamber. But we had only 10 votes out of 57. So, I mean, you can handle the executive, but if you don't handle the budget, the bills, you're basically locked. So what we exercise, we don't have a tradition of parliamentary government. So what we did was we created what's a so-called coalition unity government, and we took people from other parties and appointed them in a mix in the cabinet. It's like in the equivalent to the US to have secretaries of but from different parties. In this case, it's bipartisan, but in our country, multi-partisan. So we did that, even not having written agreements like in Germany with parliament to enforce things. But it was a way of giving up power to attain larger goals. And we had, I mean, we got into the OECD in my period. For that, we have to approve more than 14 large bills to be in compliance with the OECD. And that needed more than 38 votes. So I needed to go 10 votes plus 28, build those coalitions. And to do that, you need to be willing to give away power. And that means appointing people that's not for your party. And that means also holding your party together, because many people will say, what is it you're doing? You're giving away. So you need to hold here and hold here. And you need to receive the heat and be willing to accept it. Because one of the best advice I got from an Argentinian senator, I was just, when the inauguration day, you know, you have to greet like 1,000 people. And And he gave, but I remember him. He was the senator, the head of the House in Argentina, and he said, "I wish you the best, Mr. President." I said, "Oh, you're the House of the, you're the Speaker of the Argentina Senate. What advice will you give me?" I said, but just like casual conversation, like before next came, and he said, "Oh, President, I'll give you this piece of advice. Speeches are for the opposition, votes are for the government." I said, "Oh, thank you." And then I was reading the other one and still thinking about it because it's true. There's lots of provocation. There's lots of attacks. There's lots of, I mean, you can get lost in Twitter fighting people and trying to tell them what they deserve, and you might not reach anywhere. What you need are the votes at the end. And the votes represent bills that are approved that move change. And that also meant willing to, yes, to give away power because we might have lost in the narrative arena eventually after, but many things were done. So I know perhaps we could have won in the narrative arena, but I wouldn't be talking here about things we achieved. I might be giving a lecture on how narrative and speech can perpetuate power, but not change.
Yeah, I mean, the implications of what you're saying are truly profound. I mean, just imagine within a US political context, or almost any other political context, if the leadership said that the party line is not what's important, but you don't have to vote on the party line, that we're going to vote on larger common objectives. And the positions in this sort of the secretariat positions will be distributed across parties. It completely changes the objective function of government. And how one does that is a big question that we might ask within our own political contexts. I wonder if we might wrap up and then open up the floor with one last sort of question. Would you just give us a minute or two on what you're thinking about, planning about doing on the small state diplomacy work here at Fletcher?
Oh, that's really exciting. Well, one thing is that I'll first like to reframe the small part to problematize the concept with going further more or positioning the concept of asymmetrical relations or asymmetrical diplomacy, something like that. Because what really is about the asymmetry either in scale, population, production, military, that's relative. There is not only a measure on a state. There are Singapore, Maldives, Seychelles, Israel, Cuba, Qatar. I mean, you can name countries that we associate with small, but with certain characteristics that change that. You think Bangladesh, and you think Bangladesh as a large, very large country. But if you think in the context within that Bangladesh and its neighbors, it's relative, the kind of asymmetrical relation it's got. So that will be one, thinking about that asymmetry, which is what gives the actual context, because behind the concept of small state getting things done, the actual insight is that how come with such asymmetry of resources you get things done? So that's I think the interesting discussion. So what we are working with the Kite and with the school is to have not only a course which is the basic on that asymmetry and small states, but to train from Fletcher, to train diplomats from small countries, or we're developing small countries, to train their diplomats, their young people, and their leadership in several topics of the environmental agenda: biodiversity, climate change, desertification. But not only to train them, but to create cohorts, to create generations, One other insight is that, for example, Costa Rica doesn't have an embassy in Maldives or in Palau. We don't have the resources, but we have very similar political positions in the multilateral arena, but we don't necessarily have the chance to leverage on those kinds of alliances. For example, when I was in office, I had great contacts with Mia Motley from Barbados. She's doing a great job, and we were very like-minded. And when we showed up, even though we don't represent that huge scale, it was two strong voices in with political positions. So build those cohorts to have networks, if you will, networks of change, networks of empathy, to push that in the international debate and negotiations.
Thank you. Let's open up the floor. We've got maybe 15 or 20 minutes that we can take questions. So who's got a question, put up your hand, and we'll take 2 or 3 in a row. So we'll start here. Tell us your name, the program you're in, and then pose your question. We'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll give President Alvarado a chance to respond.
Hi, my name is Mitakshi. I'm a first-year student in the MALT program. My question to you is that a lot of state leaders set a lot of goals and missions, especially when it comes to climate leadership. But then when it comes to rallying the different sectors together, the public sector, the private sector, they sort of falter there. And what advice would you give to these state leaders? What kind of approach should they adopt when it comes to actually rallying these different sectors to achieve that goal? And what role does morality versus how ruthless a leader needs to be to achieve a goal play, especially when you have a target like 2030, which is just a couple of years away? Thank you.
Okay, so that's one very easy question. There was another one over here somewhere. Yes, in the
Yeah.
peach colored.
You're so serious, I thought you meant that. I was like, no, it's not.
Hi, I'm Michaela. I'm a second-year undergrad studying international relations. And when you were speaking, you talked about how in order to pursue a larger goal, you brought in members of opposing parties or just not your party, and brought them into kind of like the Costa Rican equivalent of secretaries, yeah, and
Ministries.
ministry. Okay, I'm wondering, had there been precedent for that in Costa Rica before? And I'm asking specifically because Professor Ibrahim had said how a concept like that is quite profound, especially when you're thinking about polarization and larger countries like America. And so I'm wondering, had there been precedent, and if so, like how you built upon that, or if there had not been, could you see something like that happening in a country like the US based on how it played out in Costa Rica?
Let's take one more on the side over here in the beige jacket.
Hi, my name is Carolina. I am a senior studying international relations and civic studies. My question kind of goes off of Michaela over there, thinking about the way you talk about empathetic leadership and sacrificing power at times for coalition building. And I think specifically thinking about a lot of male leaders around the world, what does it mean to think about a new kind of masculinity for leadership that sacrifices power at times and prioritizes what we think of soft diplomacy at times over hard diplomacy?
That's a great question. Well, I'll try to address those on how to rally different sectors. One action might have behind it different motivations. Same action with various people might have a different motivation. There are people that are one strong driver is actually morality. For example, ethics. This is the ethic thing to do. I will count myself within that. I'd say I strongly believe in this because I think it's ethical, because we have a responsibility with the next generation. We have a responsibility with the previous generations of humanity, because it's in our hands that the heritage of humanity, it outlives us, and it's there for the next generation. But now everybody buys that. There are some people that will go more in the realm of realism, or. But then I think then you again, under that logic, you need to reach out. And what is it that rings a bell for those people? And then I also believe strongly that within this huge transformation that needs to happen, there are also huge opportunities. Yes, there can be business opportunities, but also there's a huge, and that also rings a bell for many. I mean, many people are seeing the opportunity on the electrification. Many people are seeing the opportunity on all the changes that are ongoing. On agriculture, many markets are closing their borders to products that are not mitigating the emissions, so on and so forth. So there's another way you can rally other actors, not only by ethics, but more self-interest and other characteristics. At the end, there's going to be others that you'll need not to rally, but to enforce law or measures in order to that to happen. So there are several tools that need to be used. I think leadership has to be at service, not of power, but of purpose. When leadership is merely at service, power is the tool for purpose, and not the way around. I mean, your purpose cannot be power. That's an opinion. That's not a fact. That's my opinion. Because all other thing I think is we have a huge opportunity here for change, for thinking, for the whole narrative of what the world is. One of the great things I've read recently, but I read years ago, and it's one of my favorite readings of my syllabus, had to do with it's called The Principles of the Pedagogy. What do you say that?
Pedagogy, yeah.
For the non-oppressed. That's how you teach the non-oppressed to live in current world. And one of the principles has to do with how you can be happy with less. That's also an opportunity. How can we be happy with less? That's a key insight to make. Many people won't rally for that, but we need to figure the smart ways. And you can give up many power by saying something like that. But we need to figure out the ways to rally to get people inspired about this. And I don't know my generation, but I think the future generation that idea is more compelling to a future generation. Previous from what we did in Costa Rica, I mean, there has been not at the scale we did. There has been, I mean, you appoint one person, two persons. We ended up appointing persons of 5 different political parties. It was like my party had like 40% of the appointments, and the rest was distributed in other political parties. So to the scale, it has not been. And if you go and thinking, they're asking Costa Rica, was it a success? Everybody was going to say it's a failure. Actually, the experience was not repeated. But the good question will be, is a success or a failure to what end? If your goal is to retain power, obviously it's a big failure. If your aim is to have, actually it's ironic, but in the last like 20 years, we have the record of bills approved. But why is not the dominant narrative? Because many people were voting in favor of government positions. But that was part of kind of the not written deal. We were accepting their votes and accepting their attacks and not attacking back because we needed the votes. But our aim was the votes. So I read the newspaper, and this is very domestic, but anyway, I think I can say it here, but the current minister, he said he was complaining that he could not get a bill approved. And he said, well, I cannot get this approved. I only have 10 votes in Congress. And it was like, yeah, I only had 10 votes in Congress as well. That's the point. You need to reach out. You need to reach out to the others. And when I saw the State of the Union in the past days, I think that President Biden somehow has that idea someplace. It's a very different scenario, but if you think how he addressed the House, he was talking to the nation, but he was talking also to the congressmen and women. I mean, he repeat constantly, we have not yet finished our job. And because if he mentioned, like, I don't know, dozen times, the bipartisan bill on, the bipartisan, because he has got many things done because he needs to. So that concept, it's there. But I also can relate because somehow you need to grab, it's like, yeah, you're in the middle. You need to grab the others with one hand and yours are pushing in the other direction. You're in the middle of it. Part of the leadership is taking the heat in because it will be more comfortable just to be on your side. It's a much more comfortable political position. You might not get that much done in terms of bipartisanship and approvals, but you have a clear support. You're speaking to your crowd. That can work if that's an objective. First thing I believe one needs to put and question oneself constantly is, what is your objective? What is your objective? Even if your objective is maintain power, then that will explain, cascade the decisions of what is it you're going to do after. And your question was similar, right, to that and the masculinity end of it. So, well, I think there's a great example of empathetic leadership, and now that's all the way in the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and how the discussion has triggered after he had a great premiership, and also saying, I'm going to focus on my family and I'm tired, which is, I mean, she's being very sincere, and I think that it's great. I remember, and then that's why we need to explore our emotions. I remember feeling lots of resentment while in office during the pandemic, because they said that, I mean, I'm speaking very personally, but yeah, don't get me wrong, because people said, like, okay, women handle better the pandemic than men, which to some extent was true. But Costa Rica handled really well the pandemic, actually, in the numbers, not necessarily in the narrative of the people. But in the numbers, our numbers are just there with the numbers of Germany, of Luxembourg, of Switzerland, in terms of people that died and people in the growth of the economy. But also we don't have those budgets. But then I thought about it, it was because many of the things we did, in my case as a man, were seen as weak leadership. And that's because of that paradigm. There are some things that are expected from men as leaders, and it's not necessarily empathy, or it's not necessarily, and there are other things that are expected. So I think that nowadays, for good empathic leadership, women had an advantage, because in a good way, they can exercise that kind of leadership in a way better way. And men are handicapped to do that. There's a huge expectation of being the man on the horse. And the man on the horse might have the incentive not to have the thing together, but to fight. So yeah, I think we need to think about, there's also an author that mentions we need to decolonize leadership. We need to not only think of leadership in terms of male leadership, men. We need to break that software that they put in our heads of how that's exercised. Yes, there are other ways.
We're going to take two more questions. Can we take two more questions, Yanina?
Okay.
Yes, there's a lot. Let's take two. Let's take one from Professor Pazartes here. And then we'll take one over here in the view.
Thank you very much. I don't want to take the floor from students who have more, but Pecos Artis, I'm also visiting professor here. You're very inspiring. I just want to go back to what you were saying in the beginning and go back to global, look at the global arena and ask you whether you think that small states within the global arena, the UN or outside, can actually play a role in leading change, climate change problems. And I'm asking specifically because we have now Vanuatu and other small states grouping themselves within the General Assembly of the United Nations to request, for example, an advisory opinion on climate change. So all of this, and it reminded me, in the 70s, there was a group of 77, which brought much change in the UN. Do you believe, are you optimistic that, small states could play a leadership role in the global arena?
Actually, would you say just a word about your role in the human rights arena?
Oh, yeah. I was previously member and chair of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva. We now have a new member.
Rodrigo Alberto.
Ambassador. Yeah. He was just voted. Yeah, I'm out. He's in.
Okay.
I mean,
One last question.
barely out.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion so far. My name is Catherine. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental engineering. But I was just wondering about your opinion on moving from pledges to accountability. How do we ensure that the countries who promise to preserve 30% of their land or meet certain emission targets actually reach that metric?
Okay, so let's take these last two and then we'll call it a wrap.
Okay, so on the accountability part, you mean by the whole of the countries or in our case?
Just globally, anyone. I think in particular, you see a lot of countries that it's easy to pledge and less able to actually reach the implementation stage.
Well, to go through stages. In our case, we managed to do that by law. It's still one of the few signatures of the president that has the force of a law in environment areas in Costa Rica, which is kind of nice. So for that, I didn't need the coalition to get the expansion of the 30% of the Cocos Island and of the protected areas. So that's by law enforced. And now you need to have the funding, the maintenance plans. We have recruited funds in that direction, but it's kind of I think the approach there, the ideal world in many senses I've seen is to have, and also don't get me wrong, because I'm not a PhD and you are, and you're a candidate. This might sound a bit eclectic. Sometimes we, in politics and in public life and in policy, we think we need to figure it out all before we set the goals and we enforce it. And I think that should not be the case, because that's when we get paralyzed. And when people the skeptics start saying, you don't know how you're going to do it, you're not moving nowhere. So politically, it's then a politician will reach out to a person like you and say, okay, I committed this. How do I get it done? And that's how the impossible becomes possible. So at the beginning, many people said that, yeah, we should not. Now they are trying to figure out how to reach the 30 by 30. But that's generating the movement. We were not paralyzed by saying, okay, but are we going to actually get it enforced or not? So it's an approach. It's an approach. I believe in one's house, I'll try to do it more orderly in some ways. If I tell Claudia we're going to do this, I present her a budget and say it's realistic. But in this way, we needed to push.
I'm getting the signal from the powers that be that we need to wrap
Yeah.
up.
Well,
And that lunch away. It's a last thought.
that's a great question. I think that small states have the power. I think that also small states need to be very responsible in their leadership. And why did I mention? I support the loss and damage discussion, for example. But I also think we need to be very clear that that's not going to solve the thing. That we need to be very clear about it. And I think we're not being clear about it. Loss and damage is necessary. It has to be recognized. It's not only about materially recognizing things, but also a symbolic recognition about things, but that it's not the maker or break it of us saving ourselves as a species. We need to go beyond that. And that we need to that small states need to tell that ourselves, because either the Loss and Damage Fund or an international lawsuit that might be instrumental in some directions. But the question is, what is the objective? What is the objective of this all? What's the purpose? If the purpose is, again, same action might have many different motivations behind it. If the objective is to have myself a fund in which I can do stuff, well, that's a perspective. If the objective is to have all the others be, sorry for the word, be pissed off because of this, and like have, okay, you had me, you make this wrong to me, now this is going back, it's payback time. Okay, that could be fair, just, but is that going to save us? So I think we need comprehensive actions in this sense, and that's I think this might in some years will end up in a discussion of all of us changing in our comprehension of what development, what well-being is, how much we need to be well off. Lots of use of technology, but I think that's the kind of leadership we need. Very sincere about what's the end of our actions.
I'm thrilled to say that President Alvarado is going to be with us, I think, for 3 years to help us develop this kind of teaching around leadership. Really, really delighted to have you here. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
So we have box lunches outside waiting for you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.